Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is incredibly exciting and also a long time coming. That's right, today I'm going to be doing an updated top 10 favorite fantasy books. Obviously, I'm a huge fantasy lover and my most read genre by far is for sure fantasy. The last time I did this video was 2 years ago, and obviously since then I've read quite a few new series, so I thought it was time to do an updated list. I will of course have my previous video linked down below, but there are a few updates and new inclusions for this top 10 video, so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. I do want to say, these aren't in any particular order. I feel like it was hard enough to narrow this down to a top 10. All of these books are incredible, and all of these books are worth checking out if you haven't read them already. So starting off the list, I'm going to be featuring one of my all-time favorite fantasy authors. This author was honestly a more recent discovery for me, but since I started reading her books, I have been reading them non-stop for the past few years, and each series just seemingly gets better and better. So she actually takes up 2 spots of this top 10 list, so I thought I would start with both of those books. And the author I'm talking about is Robin Hobb. Robin Hobb universe, starting with, of course, the Farseer trilogy, is just one of the best fantasy universes I have ever consumed. The writing, the characters, the pacing, the escalation of the plots are just all impeccable. I love the Farseer trilogy. I honestly could have all 4 series I have read on this list. I have not read the 5th and final series yet, but I'm sure when I do read it, it will probably grace a video like this in the future. That being said, I do have 2 series from this universe that I love immensely, but I do recommend reading all of them in order, starting again with the Farseer trilogy. The first series I'm going to talk about is the Live Ship Trader series, is the second series existing within the Robin Hobb universe, and this is actually a multi-POV work and actually doesn't center Fitz, our main character, at all. This book primarily takes place in an area called Bingtown. Here the economy is very merchant focused and we follow a variety of characters kind of set in and positioned around this place. This area is also touched with magic, and one of the reasons why the merchants here are so successful, they actually have something called live ships, which are exactly as it sounds, ships that are in fact alive. Throughout this trilogy, we're following again a variety of characters from merchants to pirates, people kind of staking out on their own to try to gain control of their own destiny, villains and monsters, and the character arcs that you experience within this trilogy will utterly break you. Plot itself seems rather straightforward, just a bunch of characters kind of traversing the ocean, trying to protect their family and keep their economic interests aligned, but I promise you it really balloons in a lot of unexpected places. Emotional, gripping, unputdownable. The Live Ship Traders trilogy is impeccable. You can technically read this as a starting point to get into Robin Hobb's work, though I do recommend reading again the Farseer trilogy first, as there are some Easter eggs present within this book. I love this trilogy, probably one of my top 3 favorite fantasy trilogies of all time. I digress. Please read Robin Hobb. Speaking of Robin Hobb, I also have the Tawny Man trilogy, again by this same author. This is the 3rd series within the Robin Hobb universe, and one that will take your breath away, especially from an emotional standpoint. One of the reasons why I love Robin Hobb as a fantasy author so much is the amount of time and space that she gives her characters to grieve and also process their emotions. So much of this series, especially following our main character Fitz, is him basically coming to terms with the fact that he is kind of the chosen one within this fantasy world. We see him constantly having to mourn his life and the decisions he's had to make to basically put the crown and the safety of the kingdom first, ahead of his own desires. In the Tawny Man trilogy, we're basically reintroduced to Fitz as our main character, and this is definitely a slow build of a novel. Obviously, there are a lot of politics kind of at play here. Within the Farseer kingdom, there are different types of magic. There's also a lot of prejudice against one specific type of magic. They're also trying to shore themselves up against outside enemies. All of these things are happening throughout this entire trilogy, but the star of the show when it comes to the Tawny Man is Fitz as our main character and his incredibly unique relationship with another character named the Fool. This just beautiful mapping of this deeply intimate relationship was astonishing. I also feel like the Fool is one of the most unique characters I've ever come across in fantasy at all. The really fun thing about Robin Hobb's works is that these characters do pop up quite a bit in her other series as well, but if you want something that is just so unbelievably emotional and also a fascinating character study, especially for the consequences and the trauma that comes with actually taking on evil force, which we read over and over again in fantasy, Robin Hobb's books are the perfect ones to pick up, and you will not be disappointed by the Tawny Man trilogy. Again, one of my top 10 favorite series of all time. The next book I have to recommend is another just truly unique piece of fantasy, and that is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. N.K. Jemisin, honestly, like all the authors present in this video, is just one of my go-to favorite authors. She's never disappointed me, and I also feel like her fantasy series are truly so unique, and not just from the concepts of the world, but also the execution, from the writing to just the plot itself. Everything about it is refreshing. But if you're not familiar, the Broken Earth trilogy is essentially set in a world that is constantly ending over and over again from natural disaster. This humanity and civilization has kind of evolved to live in small communities. People have very specific rules, and everything is kind of written down, so if humanity ends again, they can try to pick up the pieces as best they can once the world sort of rights itself. The reason why civilization ends so constantly is that the earth is very much alive. Tsunamis and earthquakes are constantly upending the environment, and the magic very much centers around the power of the earth too. There are people in this world that can basically harness this power, but instead of being lauded as possible heroes, they are deeply feared and actually controlled by the government itself. In book 1, we're introduced to 3 characters: a young girl who's just starting her training in magic, a young woman who's kind of taking her first posting after graduating this magical academy, and a mother who is searching for her lost daughter. This fantasy series, again, is truly so unique and gripping. The plot will take you in so many unexpected directions. This first book is also primarily written in second POV, which was done to such great success. Aside of having just a truly fantastic fantasy plot, this book also touches on topics such as identity, race, gender, concepts of motherhood, queer identity. All of it is just seamlessly blended into one of the best fantasy trilogies of all time. I marathon this. I read this on the train when I read it for the first time, and I would miss my stop consistently because I could not put it down. Next up shouldn't be too much of a surprise, and I'm sure graces many top 10 lists, but honestly I think for good reason. And that is the Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson. This is a new, very, very epic, very, very long fantasy series by Brandon Sanderson, but fear not, you can trust this author to actually finish the series, unlike many of the other well-known writers out there that have left us hanging for many, many years. So far, the Stormlight Archive has 4 books out. I have read every book now multiple times, and each time I feel like I always glean new information, I come away with new feelings, but always I just cannot put them down. Obsessed with this epic work by Brandon Sanderson, and I can't wait to see where it continues to evolve and what direction he takes us in. I will obviously give you a synopsis, but keep in mind that each book is about 1,000 pages long, so a lot of plot takes place. So I'm really just giving you like the very beginning of this fantasy world, but understand like so much happens, so many character arcs occur, and the cool thing too is that each book sort of centers a different main character. You're constantly shifting from different points of views, but I would say like each book kind of has a central POV where we really deep dive into their past and into their emotions, which makes you feel very connected to so many people within this series. But the Stormlight Archive starts off with the Way of Kings, and this is set in a fantasy world that has always been at war. There's one powerful kingdom that kind of has a set of lords, and they have been on this plane fighting against this other group of individuals for a very long time. This war has kind of evolved though from constant and immediate conflict to kind of war parties going out and trying to find like lucrative materials. It's kind of a farce of a war, if you ask me. In this first book, we're introduced to a variety of characters. First, we have Kaladin, who was once a warrior and a doctor who now finds himself a slave within this war camp. Follow a general of the army named Dalinar. We follow a scholar who is also disguising herself as a thief and is basically trying to worm her way up into a powerful position to save her family. Her name is Shallan. Again, there are so many other characters to discover, and the escalation of this plot. There's so much action and magic and mystery. Brandon Sanderson is known for his plots for a reason. Each book absolutely kept me guessing, mind-blowing, such a fun experience. And the really fun thing about all of Brandon Sanderson's adult fantasy works is that they kind of exist in the same universe, so there are crossover characters, just a lot of subtle connectedness that is really fun to parse out as well. If you haven't read the Stormlight Archives, it's a blast. You gotta do it. Next up is another new series added to this list, and that is the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. This is a newer, read for me. I read the entirety of this trilogy kind of at the beginning of this year and through the end of last year. I loved it. Joe Abercrombie's characters and his slow build of his plots make not only a satisfying reading experience, but also a very unexpected one as well. The trilogy is a work of grim, dark fantasy, meaning all of the characters are pretty morally gray and the world itself is rather brutal. So you're reading this series kind of liking everyone, but also recognizing that they're all terrible people. For reference, my favorite character in this entire trilogy tortures people for a living. This particular trilogy I also feel like is really well paced. The first one, being The Blade itself, is really just introducing us to our main set of characters, and then we see the slow build of the plot throughout books 2 and 3. And this slow moving escalation not only allowed us to really get in our characters' heads, but also made for incredible plot payoff. But a bit more about the book itself. So in book 1, we're introduced to our primary characters. The first is Glokta, who was once a war hero, but after being captured and tortured in the previous conflict, he came home with a lot of life-altering injuries. From there, he kind of became involved in the state, and he's kind of an inquisitor, an investigator, and again, tortures people. And he sort of gets involved in sort of backroom politics, and it's a fascinating storyline to follow. We also follow a character named Logan, who is a northerner and kind of part of a mercenary group of warriors. And at the beginning of this book, he is separated from them and just decides to travel south for no real reason, runs into a very powerful magic wielder, and this guy basically tells Logan that he's going to go on a quest with him, and Logan has nothing better to do, so he decides to follow along. Last main character we follow is Giselle, a pompous young officer in the army who is honestly not even that talented, but he's taking on a very important sword competition to make a name for himself. There are a lot of other characters introduced in this world, but those are kind of the primary ones, and we see a lot of characters orbit around them. Seeing how these characters interface, run into each other, and leave each other is such a fascinating experience. The trilogy is amazing, and because the characters are morally gray, it's very unpredictable how they're going to react in different situations. I gasped my way through this book. There were so many stunning scenes. This would make a fantastic TV show, but it is also an amazing fantasy trilogy, and I personally can't wait to check out more works by Joe Abercrombie, but I loved the First Law trilogy. Next up, I have another very, very dark fantasy series recommendation, and that is the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. This is a very fascinating work of fantasy that is also heavily influenced by our own history, particularly the invasion of China by Japan and their colonial pursuits of taking over this country. The thing about this trilogy is I think on the surface, and if you read the synopsis and even the first part of this book, it feels like a very specific style of story, but there is a very clear shift about halfway through that carries through the rest of the trilogy that is very, very dark. In this story, we're basically following our main character, Ren. At the beginning of this book, she is studying incredibly hard to take a set of examinations because she's wanting to flee from her very poor province. She actually does incredibly well, and she gains acceptance into the most prestigious military school in all the land. Thinking finally she has found the answer of how to escape an unwanted marriage and poverty, she arrives at the school to make a name for herself, but quickly realizes not only due to her gender, but also her darker complexion, she is singled out by everyone and treated very, very poorly. At the beginning of this book, she also discovers that she has a set of shamanistic powers, and she begins to explore those. Again, the first half of book 1 is very much like a school sort of setting. Everyone is just trying their best, everyone is very pompous, but working very, very hard. But again, the shift occurs within this series once the invasion actually happened. Now young students aren't just learning about concepts of war, but are now actively participating in it. And from there, R.F. Kuang begins to explore the harrowing realities of conflict, how no matter what decision you make, there's always going to be casualty, how many different situations our characters find themselves in between a rock and a hard place. And particularly, we're following our main character is dead set on revenge. She is brutal, she is bloody, and she will do anything for her own survival. And in large part, you can understand this drive to survive. There is always a cost to any decision that is made within this trilogy. And I think the contrast between this initial school setting to the harrowing realities of conflict and war makes for a very stark reading experience, and why I think this trilogy is just so unbelievably successful. This book is a ride from beginning to end. As I mentioned, it's brutal. It has a lot of military strategy at the heart of this book as well. Make no mistake though, this is a book full of gray morality. family, and really just a bunch of young people trying to survive and make it to the next day. The Poppy War, I think, was a fantastic trilogy through and through. R.V. Kuang has also come out with some other fantastic works too, so this is a great author to just check out in general. The next book I have to recommend is a more literary fiction leaning fantasy series, but also one that is just wholly so original and whimsical. That is the Books of Babel series by Josiah Bancroft, the first one being Senlin Ascends. I feel like it combines so many interesting elements. It sort of has the whimsy and strangeness of a middle grade portal fantasy, has the beautiful lyrical writing style of literary fiction, has the world building, character writing, and just overall fascinating plot of a traditional fantasy story. And all of these elements come together to just create one of the best reading experiences I have had in years. But if you're not familiar, Senlin Ascends follows one of our main characters, Senlin. And at the beginning of book one, he is traveling to this mythical place called the Tower of Babel, which is this huge tower, as you would guess, made up of many, many floors and full of so many people. He arrives there with his new wife. He's dreamed of traveling here his entire life, decides to take his honeymoon as an opportunity to finally travel here and explore it with the one he loves most. Unfortunately, though, at the beginning of this book, he and his wife are separated immediately, and so begins Senlin's journey as he enters this tower in hopes of finding his lost wife. This book has so many fantastic things going for it. First off, the setting of the tower is fantastic. Not only does each floor kind of have its own vibe, but it also has its own perils, government, and just tricky situations that our main character Senlin has to work through. Seeing and understanding each floor of this tower was one of my favorite parts of this series overall. Fantasy vibe-wise, I would say this kind of has elements of steampunk, and trying to understand the mechanisms and what actually powers the tower and all of the sort of machines that exist within it is another super cool part of this book too. But what anchors this tale are the characters. Not just Senlin, but you also run into a huge cast of characters throughout the 4 books of this series. You become emotionally attached to each one, and just the arc and their journey throughout this tower, and also just the chapters you get to experience in their lives is amazing. All of these things come together to just truly make one of the most unique and interesting reading experiences I have had in the fantasy genre. I love this series. It is amazing. Finished up this year, and I can't wait to see what this author does next. Surprise! We have another Brandon Sanderson series on this list. I had to include it. This is another series I have read multiple times at different points in my life and just continues to be a favorite that I can't remove from this top 10, and that is the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. This was one of my very first forays into epic fantasy, and because of that, maybe that's why I'm a little nostalgic for it, but honestly, I really feel like it holds up. This has such an interesting magic system and one of the most twisty and turny plots that I feel like I've ever encountered. This has blown my mind multiple times on multiple different rereads, and I've just loved it for well over a decade now. But if you're not familiar, this trilogy starts with the Final Empire, and it's set in a fantasy world where the bad guy has won. The Dark Lord has kind of been reigning over this land for thousands of years, and there's very little hope of anything actually changing. In this world, there's also a specific type of magic system, and that is centered around the consumption of metals. When you consume different metals and different alloys, they basically have different reactions. People can do different things, and there are a very few select individuals that can actually consume all the metals and harness all the power, and they are called Mistborn. In the first book, it's very much like a heist novel, a group of people kind of working together to try to overthrow this Dark Lord. But again, nothing is straightforward in Brandon Sanderson novels, and the plot really balloons very, very quickly. This also has a fantastic cast of characters, from our main character Vin to so many others we meet along the way. I love the Mistborn trilogy. I also think it's a great starting point if you're newer to epic fantasy or high fantasy, and I promise you will love it if you haven't for some reason read this. Next, I feel like is a very underrated trilogy, and that is the City of Stairs series by Robert Jackson Bennett. You might know him from his other work, Foundryside, which I also love, but I truly feel like the City of Stairs and the subsequent 2 other books are just better. I love them. I feel like they're such an interesting combination of genres. Again, I describe this as like a fantasy novel meets political thriller. The concept, the setting is so strong, and Robert Jackson Bennett's execution of it all was flawless. Not to mention, I also really enjoy this series because each book actually centers a different main character. Everyone is very much connected, but there's also actually large time skips between each book, allowing for the political stakes to continue to simmer and just allowing time to sort of develop things on the back end, and it all works beautifully. If you're not familiar, the setup of this series is there was once this very powerful land named Bulakov, and they were incredibly powerful because they were able to harness the power of the gods. Everything in this land was basically a product of the gods, from their infrastructure to their government, and they also used the power of the gods to try to conquer the world. And one of these lands that were being colonized by this powerful empire actually fought back, killing off the gods. And this resulted in a catastrophic event called the Blink, where basically all infrastructure in this empire disappeared instantly. Keep in mind, the gods were embedded in everything from buildings to sidewalks to bridges, and all of that collapsed in one simultaneous instant. After this event, the country that actually killed off the gods began to control Bulakov and outlawing any sort of conversation or reference to the gods itself, including anything to do with religion. In this book, we follow one of our main characters who is an agent from this very country, and she's basically sent on assignment to one of the cities in Bulakov to investigate sort of murmurings of uprising and the possible resurrection of the gods. And that's where I kind of say this is a political thriller novel, because this very much has like espionage, sort of infiltration-esque vibe. It also has to do a lot with government conflict, but also the consequences of that conflict to populations at large. This series is just very, very nuanced and very, very emotional, and we're kind of following a different person, again, as I've already mentioned, in a different city, in a different situation, and it's just so fascinating. It all just worked together so well. One of the most brilliant and, again, I feel underrated fantasy series out there. Last on my list is my only urban fantasy selection, but truly one of my favorite trilogies as well, and that is the Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee. I love this trilogy. This is another completed trilogy, and I can promise you book 1, 2, and 3 are all amazing for different reasons. This is an urban fantasy series sort of centering crime families. It definitely has like mob vibes, but also a lot of geopolitical situations as well. But a bit more about this book. This book is set on the fictional island of Kekon, and here Jade rules. Here, certain bloodlines are able to wear and harness the power of Jade, and this makes them stronger, faster than the average person. Jade is also only existing on this island. The production, distribution, and selling of this very valuable resource is completely controlled by crime families. Throughout the series, we're basically reading from a variety of POVs from one of those crime families called the Cows, and at the beginning of book 1, there's sort of this cold war between them and another powerful group, and throughout this entire trilogy, we see the escalation of that conflict through not only years, but also generations. This book is riveting. If you love kind of, again, a crime family setting, backdoor dealing, backstabbing, street fights, but also fights through unexpected avenues like economics and geopolitical alliances, this is the trilogy for you. Again, because we're following so many different characters, there's so many people to fall in love with, and because of the, let's just say, profession of some of these people and it not being necessarily entirely legal, there are some very shocking moments and gray morality to explore. It's a story about family, blood, and loyalty. It has so much action, and I loved it so much. Such a unique concept, such a unique world, and also includes a lot of really interesting thematic elements as well. If you love fantasy of any kind, you should definitely check out the Green Bone Saga. Even if you don't read a lot of urban fantasy, I promise you will love it. Alrighty guys, those are my top 10 favorite fantasy series. Again, this is just my own personal list. This does not have to be your list, but I do stand by all of these books. Loved them very, very much. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye!